A Canadian law professor is advocating for an end to heritage-based legal rights for Indigenous people in Canada, saying it conflicts with a free society and the rule of law.
A Vancouver bylaw will fine homeowners for not registering their wood-burning fireplaces and stoves with the city.
Air Canada flight attendants, represented by CUPE National, have ended their 3-day strike, which had grounded flights last week. Hello Canada, it's Wednesday, August 20th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
I'm Zoltan.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. A Canadian law professor is advocating for an end to special legal rights for Indigenous people in Canada, citing that lineage-based privileges conflict with a free society and the rule of law. In a commentary published August 15th in the National Post, Bruce Pardy, a professor at Queen's University, said Indigenous rights enshrined in the Constitution represent a return to outdated ideas where legal status depends on ancestry. Pardy wrote, quote, "Legal rights should not depend on lineage, Indigenous or otherwise. In a free country governed by the rule of law, Aboriginal rights should not exist." The piece comes amid recent court decisions highlighting tensions over Indigenous land claims and private property rights. British Columbia Supreme Court judge ruled last month that the Cowichan First Nation holds Aboriginal title over 800 acres of government land in Richmond, BC. The decision stated Aboriginal title is a, quote, prior and senior right to fee simple title, potentially overriding public or private ownership. If upheld on appeal, the ruling could threaten property security in areas with Aboriginal title claims, including BC and New Brunswick, Pardy said. In a separate November decision, a New Brunswick King's Bench judge suggested that successful Indigenous land claims might lead to government expropriation of private property to transfer it to Indigenous groups. Pardy described these outcomes as logical extensions of Supreme Court of Canada jurisprudence on Indigenous law, which he said aligns with deeply held Canadian views on special status for Indigenous people under Section 35 of the Constitution. Alex, could you elaborate a little bit on Pardy's points about how Indigenous ancestry-based rights, or lineage-based privileges as he calls them, conflict with operating as a democratic society governed by the rule of law?
So I think that Pardy makes several very convincing and compelling arguments in his article, which was published in the National Post. And amongst them, what he says is that the granting of Aboriginal title to folks based off of their lineage or their heritage is in contravention of equality under the law, which is a principle of the West, that we're all treated equally under the law. Interestingly enough, in Canada, under Section 35, we're not treated equally. And I suppose that's something that he's decrying, and that this decision from a BC Supreme Court judge after what is being described as the longest trial in Canadian history it echoes the fact that we are not treated equally under the law. He also makes another interesting point, which is that land disputes are not unique to Canada. They exist everywhere. For instance, if you look in Europe, you can see there's a war between Ukraine and Russia over a land dispute. Transcarpathia is an area in Eastern Europe that is traditionally occupied by Hungarians, but it was transferred to Ukrainians, more than a century ago now. So you could apply this logic to virtually anywhere on Earth, and you could have these land disputes. And again, to Pardy's point, I think that they are contradictory towards the basic principles of private property and equality of people under the law. Vancouver homeowners with wood-burning fireplaces and stoves must register them with the local government or risk fines up to $500. The Metro Vancouver bylaw is being pushed by environmental regulators and takes effect on September 15th. The regional district says smoke from residential wood burning is the largest source of fine particulate matter in the region. Julie Saxton, Metro Vancouver's air quality manager, said the policy is not designed to eliminate fireplaces or stoves outright, but to bring standards in line with modern emission levels. She told CBC News, quote, "We're not trying to ban this activity, we're trying to introduce lower emissions to reduce the effects on people's health." Metro Vancouver estimates there are tens of thousands of fireplaces and stoves still in operation across the region, potentially as many as 100,000. The district says residential burning accounts for about a quarter of the area's particulate emissions, even as stricter regulations have reduced pollution from other sources such as industry, marine shipping, and heavy-duty vehicles. Residents will be required to register appliances located within the urban containment boundary, and officials say enforcement will begin with education and outreach. Repeat offenders may face a $500 fine. Exemptions will be allowed for low-income households or those facing emergencies. So, Cosmin, have there been any other instances of what critics might call government overreach in pursuit of climate action in BC? And what about the rest of Canada?
Well, absolutely. And it's not just BC, it's everywhere, particularly Quebec. But this is all just part of the creep, the bureaucratic creep and expansion of power under the guise of climate change activism and advocacy. Here we have the government essentially saying you have to register a piece of your property. I mean, you already registered your home, they know where you live, but they want to tally up how many wood burning stoves or fireplaces there are. And this is how it begins. They start by saying, "Oh, we're just trying to inform the public and educate people." But they leave the door open for fines. And when you have legislation like this set up, the government can essentially gather all that data and use that information for other purposes, or if they want to go further. And past experiences have shown that they do go further, potentially even fining people just for owning these things. But that's not the case right now. But we have seen moves to even eliminate things like natural gas heating in Vancouver. So last year, Vancouver City Council actually upheld the ban on natural gas heating for new homes, even though Mayor Ken Sim and other councillors were opposed to the idea. The ban was upheld. So this just sets a precedent. And the government, these, especially when they're driven by climate activists, they ignore the public pushback, because it wasn't only the public in Vancouver that was pushing back against a natural gas ban. It's also developers, builders, etc. It makes things more expensive, first of all, to develop property. Natural gas heating is actually a pretty cheap way to heat your home. And arguably, it's a better and more environmentally friendly way to heat your home than other options. But this has been a trend, right? So Vancouver, they've been pushing to ban natural gas since I think back to 2016, and they eventually achieved that. There's also been pushes in Montreal where they've pushed to ban natural gas in new homes, but also other Quebec municipalities. So definitely it's very widespread. The strike by Air Canada flight attendants, represented by the Canadian Union of Public Employees National, has ended after 3 days of grounded flights. The National Public Workers Union announced Tuesday that flight attendants at Air Canada and Air Canada Rouge have reached a tentative agreement. This comes just days after Prime Minister Mark Carney's government, through Jobs Minister Patty Hajdu, declared the flight attendant strike unlawful and directed the Canada Industrial Relations Board to force arbitration. On Monday, Hajdu said ideally the two parties would reach an agreement without forced arbitration. CUPE leadership vowed to stay on the picket line even if it meant facing arrest, charges, and fines. Details of the agreement are not yet available to members, but unions are advising their membership to return to work and resume operations. According to CUPE Ontario, the union worked from 7 p.m. Monday to 4:23 a.m. to reach the deal with the help of the union's chief mediator, William Kaplan, whom both parties agreed to as a mediator. Air Canada similarly released a statement Tuesday morning confirming that the strike has ended and a tentative agreement reached. The airline announced flights are scheduled for Tuesday evening, but warned customers that it could take 7 to 10 days to return to full regular service as aircraft and crew are out of position. Some flights might be canceled during that 10-day window. So, Alex, just from observing the media and public conversation around this issue, do you suppose that there's public backing behind the government's decision to send airline workers back to work?
It's a mixed bag. So I would say that the vast majority of the public is probably in favor of them going back to work under any circumstances because they were actually deemed not essential workers, but flight attendants are essential workers effectively because planes can't operate without them. And especially in a country as big as Canada, people rely very heavily on the airlines. That being said, I think that people were also very much in favor of what the workers were bargaining for, which is the right to be paid for all of their work and to be compensated fairly for the work that they do. I think that there's a few reasons why there was so much sympathy, if you will, for the Air Canada employees. One is that largely people really don't like the institution. Air Canada is not a particularly popular corporation in Canada, and they have what many people would consider, I think quite rightly, to be an unfair market share with regards to Canadian aviation. They are also not really well renowned for their customer service or their reliability. And also, you saw a lot of bipartisan support. So you saw folks like Pierre Poilievre and also Michelle Rempel-Garner both advocating on behalf of the workers, as well as Don Davies and the regular NDP crowd who are typically in favor of unions during these types of negotiations. So I would say that it is a mixed bag. I don't think that people are happy with the fact that the government interfered in the bargaining, especially as early as they did. Patty Hajdu has a terrible reputation from her previous portfolios, and I think that she's continuing to carry a terrible reputation. And so there's very little faith in her, specifically as the Minister of Jobs, and there's very little goodwill amongst Canadians as pertains to her specifically. But I think that ultimately Canadians are happy that they will be happy if planes are operating in the regular dysfunctional fashion that they typically do.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.